Something about Paul McCartney has always seemed too good to be true. He's one of the most beloved, most celebrated, most successful musicians in history. He has written or co-written 32 #1 Billboard hits. That's more than any other artist ever. He has 18 Grammys, 2 American Music Awards, 2 MTV Awards, an Academy Award, a Library of Congress Gershwin Prize for Popular Song, a Grand Cross of the Order of the Sun, and he has all of these others. He's even like a knight, like a knight. Not a night, but like the Queen of England put a sword on his shoulder, and now he is literally a companion of honor to the crown. He has performed more than 20 major international concert tours in his life, and at the age of 82 has recently completed a 2-year, 59-show-long post-COVID Got Back tour that he began in 2022. He continues to sell out stadiums all over the world. He has millions of dedicated fans, including me, probably including you, and he has the respect of his fellow musicians and producers. He's literally the type of rock star that other rock stars tell stories about.
Paul comes over. Who are you talking to? I'm like, oh, I'm just talking to my brother Robert. Grabs the phone, puts his arm around me. He goes, hey, Robert, how you doing, man? Paul's like, I'm here with your little brother, Robert. He's doing good. No, we're doing good. And go, how are you, man? And Robert's just like...
I worked with McCartney after the Thriller record, Jeff McCartney. Initially, he was like, don't talk too much about the Beatles and all this stuff. And like, how can you not?
Any guitar player, for example, who's ever like tried to learn their way through the Beatles songbook knows that McCartney's songs were often like the most musically complex. I mean, you're sitting there, you're like 11, you're learning these like fun little 3-chord, 4-chord songs, and you get to this song called Yesterday. And it has 12 chords in it. 12 chords, Paul? I'm 11 years old. I'm at camp. I got swim practice in 20 minutes. I'm trying to impress Danielle over here with my guitar playing. I got to learn 12 chords to get to this song, buddy? It's one of the reasons, honestly, that as much as I love Paul McCartney's music, Yesterday has always kind of bugged me a little bit, but we're getting off topic. Why she had to go, I don't know. She wouldn't say. Not only is Paul McCartney a brilliant musician, but he also seems to be a pretty nice guy too. Like in every interview or special or documentary about him that I've ever seen, he's always been pleasant, calm, sober, polite. You know, he's not pretentious or aloof or like too cool for the interview or, you know, too cool for the interviewer. Historically, many rock stars, like regardless of their level of talent, have been very, very big, obvious assholes as like a vibe. They like choose it, right? It's like a personality trait they try to portray.
Iggy, how are you, mate? Listen, welcome to the show. The first time I saw you was in Detroit a couple of years ago, live in concert.
I think the idea is essentially like, the bigger of an asshole I am, the more talented I must be for you all to have to put up with me. But McCartney absolutely isn't like that. He's never thrown a yogurt at a flight attendant or peed on a national landmark or stolen 2 cases of beer from a 7-Eleven while spitting at the cashier.
And I just kind of coughed up a lug and spit at her because that's just where my mindset was at the time.
He doesn't adopt children from their parents so he can marry them and take them across state lines. He doesn't set up cameras in the... Actually, I'm just going to bleep that whole thing out. It's too gross. McCartney's a good dad. He's ethical. He's principled, right? He's been a vegetarian since like 1975. A lot of rock stars will like temporarily adopt a pet cause to boost their profile for a bit. But McCartney has actually lived as a vegetarian for almost 50 years. And with money. That takes dedication. That's a lot of steak dinners to pass up.
Wow, Paul McCartney.
Linda and I both feel strongly about animal rights. In fact, if you play Maybe I'm Amazed backwards, you'll hear a recipe for a really ripping lentil soup.
Paul McCartney is by most, if not all, appearances a good man. But what if it's all too good to be true? What if behind the cherubic, charming, talented, handsome face lies the heart or the brain as the... What if behind all of it lies the heart of a secret asshole? That's the last guitar, I promise. It's getting a little silly. Throughout his career, Paul McCartney has tragically been accused of secret assholery on multiple occasions. Many Beatles fans still resent Paul for allegedly breaking up the band in 1970 for what many people think were primarily financial and selfish reasons, though Paul has protested against this in the years since.
Who broke it up?
John.
John did.
Yeah.
And he tried to pin it all on you.
No, I don't think anyone tried to pin it on you. It just came out that way.
John Lennon said he was a perfectionist, called him a PR man, said he was the best in the business. Lennon also ruthlessly criticized McCartney's early solo work.
I thought Paul's was rubbish, I think he'd make a better one when he's frightened into it. But I thought that first one was just a load of, I told you, light and whatever, that crack.
And called his contributions to the Beatles granny songs.
Yesterday, all my
George Harrison accused McCartney of being manipulative and hurtful to his confidence as a musician.
No confidence in myself as a guitar player, having spent so many years with Paul McCartney, because he ruined me as a guitar player.
In what way?
Well, I don't know. I think it's easier just to read what... because he also seemed to have done the same thing to Henry McCulloch, because I remember reading something that Henry said that he left Wings and he just left it because he said, I don't know if I'm good or I'm bad. I can play this or I can't play anything.
Then Paul's band Wings, which he started with his wife Linda. Wings blossomed into one of the biggest touring acts of the 70s. Then that band broke up in a similarly tumultuous way, with some people saying Paul's secret passive-aggressive, secret asshole side was to blame there as well. Maybe Paul McCartney has like a secret personality. Maybe he's even like a secret sociopath, right? Someone who's always pretending to be very caring, very deep, very genuine, but if you look close enough, you can see they're kind of shallow. You can see through the cracks of their personality and that they're kind of uncaring, and misanthropic and other words, Someone, for example, who would show no emotion after hearing about the death of his best friend.
What time did you hear the news? This morning sometime. Very early? Yeah. Don't know, yeah? Drag, isn't it?
Now, all successful artists have haters, and the more successful they are, the more haters they're going to hear from. And maybe all this hate, all of these rumors, all of these allegations, all of this kind of gossipy nonsense against Paul McCartney is just that. It's just a form of jealousy. But maybe not. If I've learned anything from 90s TV shows, it was that there was always three sides to every story. There was the first person's account, there was the second person's account, and then there was the way it really happened. Well, that third category, that's us. That's what we're here to do today. We're here to be that third point of view. We're going to look at his actions. We're going to look at what he actually did and determine scientifically if Paul McCartney is or isn't an asshole. Let's begin. Asshole accusation number 1. Paul McCartney broke up the Beatles. On April 10th, 1970, Paul McCartney released an interview where he announced the collapse of the Lennon-McCartney songwriting partnership that had dominated the pop charts since 1962. In those 8 years, Paul and John wrote 180 songs together, with 20 of them reaching number 1. They had become the most famous songwriting duo since Gilbert and Sullivan. But now, that was apparently all over. The late 60s were like rampant with rumors that the Beatles were fighting, that their egos were clashing, and that the band was on the verge of breakup. McCartney gave this interview to his friend and Apple executive Peter Brown, who asked Paul a series of pre-written questions about his upcoming album and the rumors that the Beatles were breaking up. The Daily Mirror published the now famous headline, "Paul is quitting the Beatles." And newspapers everywhere started taking Paul's press release as confirmation that the rumors about the Beatles breaking up were all true. Crowds gathered at Abbey Road studios, fans were devastated, people were furious at Paul, thinking he'd simply quit the band just to go solo.
Barbara, we are going to your father's broadcast. No, I'm never coming out. I hate Paul.
Now, there is quite a bit of debate about what really happened at this time and who really broke up the Beatles. And there was a lot of assholery going around at that time from all four Beatles. So I've done my best to create a timeline of events that led up to the Beatles split. I mean, this list could really start back as far as the death of Brian Epstein in 1967. But for brevity's sake, we're just going to start with the rooftop concert on Abbey Road Studios that took place on January 30th, 1969. January 30th, 1969, the Beatles performed their final concert ever on the roof of Abbey Road Studios. They scrapped earlier plans to perform a concert in Libya and chose instead to just go up on the roof and play. February 3rd, 1969, with their record company Apple in financial freefall, the Beatles officially hire Rolling Stones manager and famous piece of shit Alan Klein as the new CEO, with the hope that he will pull the record company out of its deep debt obligations. Paul disagrees with the hire, wants his father-in-law Lee Eastman to represent the band instead, but the other three feel Paul's too close to Eastman, and so they outvote him and go with Klein. February 22nd, 1969, the Beatles return to Abbey Road Studio to begin recording the Abbey Road album. March 1969, famous piece of shit Alan Klein gets to work restructuring Apple Corp to his liking. He fires staff, streamlines operations, and begins a protracted legal process to try and gain control over all of the Beatles' publishing rights, including those owned by John and Paul's original publishing company, Northern Songs. May 19th, 1969, the Beatles and Klein gather at Olympic Sound Studios. Klein insists that all four Beatles have to sign a 3-year management contract, making Klein the official manager of the Beatles. Paul again refuses. August 20th, 1969, Abbey Road is completed and prepared for release the following month before Let It Be. September 1969, John Lennon's heroin use gets out of hand, so he and Yoko decide to quit the drug cold turkey. Lennon then writes the song Cold Turkey about his experiences getting clean, which he hopes to turn into a Beatles single. The band refuses, however, due to its darker tone and subject matter. September 8th, 1969, John and George approach Paul with an idea for a new way to record albums. They suggest the now infamous 4-4-4-2 plan, which would include 4 songs from John, 4 from Paul, 4 from George, and 2 from Ringo, plus a single at Christmas. The Lennon-McCartney shared writing credit would end, and each Beatle would take full credit for their own songs. Paul rejects the idea, later calling it too democratic for its own good. September 13th, 1969, John flies to the Toronto Rock and Blues Revival Festival with Yoko Ono, Eric Clapton, Klaus Voormann, and Alan White. They play Cold Turkey live for the first time. So Lennon has an incredible time in Toronto. He calls his new band the Plastic Ono Band and decides on the flight home that he will leave the Beatles to pursue a solo career. September 20th, 1969, Lennon tells Paul, Ringo, and famous piece of shit Alan Klein that he wants a divorce and that he is leaving the band. Famous piece of shit Alan Klein convinces John to keep the news quiet, though, while they renegotiate the Beatles' record contracts. Announcing that the band was splitting up now could affect their ability to get a good deal and cost them all a lot of money. Lennon agrees. September 26th, 1969, Abbey Road is released to the public and is an immediate hit. Critics and fans adore the album. October 22nd, 1969, fed up with Alan Klein's changes at Apple and upset about the future of the Beatles, Paul retreats up to his home in Scotland with his wife and family. He's depressed, drinking heavily, and writing a lot of music. November to December 1969, Paul writes and records the entirety of his first solo album, McCartney. He uses early in-home recording equipment and plays every instrument on the album himself. Christmas 1969, Paul returns home to London to complete mixing and finishing McCartney. He contacts Apple executive Neil Aspinall, and they agree that they will release McCartney's album in April on Apple Records. January 27th, 1970, John Lennon writes and records the single Instant Karma over the course of 10 days with legendary rock producer Phil Spector at EMI Studios in London. It goes to number 3 on the pop charts. March 23, 1970, Alan Klein hires Phil Spector to turn the record Get Back project into the, quote, Let It Be album, since Glyn Johns had tried 3 times already and failed to make a finished album that all 4 Beatles could agree on. Spector comes in and remixes the entire album, including adding harps, horns, and an orchestra section with a woman's choir to Paul's song The Long and Winding Road without his permission. Paul is outraged. March 31st, 1970, Ringo goes to Paul McCartney with a letter from the band informing him that his album McCartney wouldn't be released in April, but would instead be delayed until June, since the group had already agreed to release Ringo's solo album first, Sentimental Journey. Paul is outraged again and kicks Ringo out of his home. There's even rumors of a fistfight, but this can't be confirmed.
But Ringo hand-delivers this.
I know.
You took him and threw him right out of the fucking house.
I did.
Yes.
I did.
Yeah.
Well, you know,
I don't blame you.
It was bad enough that we were splitting up.
Yeah.
It was bad enough that all that money we'd earned and all that fame was going down the pan.
Yes.
And there was this guy who was going to take it all. And it was that close.
Yes.
And I was having to fight. I said, no, guys, we can keep it. We don't have to give it to this guy, you know. And there's Ringo delegated to come around to me and tell me, because my release date was firmly fixed.
Yes.
And everyone knew this was the release date. So I was going, okay, well, this is okay.
Yeah.
And then they come around, Ringo comes around, he says, no, you won't.
With his legal paper.
Fuck off! Get out of my house!
Oh, my God.
And he did.
And you must have
Well,
been...
again, even that, you know, we got it back together.
Yeah, I
again.
know.
That's families for you.
April 10th, 1970, Paul releases a self-interview announcing his album McCartney and the ending of his writing partnership with John Lennon. The Daily Mirror publishes the headline, Paul is quitting the Beatles. Other newspapers follow suit, and the world begins mourning the death of the biggest pop group in history. April 20th, 1970, 10 days later, Paul releases McCartney, which is then summarily brutalized by critics. Many feel the critical response was at least in part a backlash to Paul for quote-unquote breaking up the Beatles. May 13th, 1970, Let It Be is released with Phil Spector's additions. December 1970, Paul sues the rest of the Beatles to get out of his contract with Apple. Whew, okay. So in point of fact, John Lennon initiated the final breakup of the Beatles, but Paul McCartney, I mean, he completed it. He even kind of acknowledges it in this interview.
Now, John was hurt. What was he hurt by? What was the single biggest thing that we can find in all our research that hurt John? The biggest thing I can find is that I told the world the Beatles were finished. I don't think that's so hurtful. I know he'd said, you know, it was like for publicity for my album, but I don't even think that's hurtful. Big deal.
Now, daydreamers can like imagine a world where the Beatles broke up quietly and went off and recorded their own songs, their own albums alone, and then like maybe made amends and got back together a few years later and started recording again. It works for the Stones. It works for Radiohead. The Beatles could have done it too. But on the other hand, you could see that approach really as a form of, lying.
I'll tell you what was unfortunate, the method of announcing it all. I said to the guy at the office, happened to be Peter Brown of Book Fame, I said, I've got an album coming out, can't we? I don't really want to see too much press. Can you do me some question and answer things? So he sent all those questions over. I answered them all. We had them printed up and put in the press copies of the album. But I think the perception of that when it arrived on the journalist's desk was, oh, this is McCartney, really number. It wasn't a number scene. I see it now and I kind of shudder. Oh, bloody hell. I can see it quite clearly. At the time, it was me trying to answer some questions that were being asked, and I decided to not fudge that question.
Paul was only being honest. Nothing in that press release wasn't what he truly kind of felt at the time. He just didn't lie in order to get a better record deal. Plus, the Beatles never officially did get back together. Yes, they played with each other again. Yes, they, forgave each other, which is something, we'll talk about in a moment. But the band stayed broken up. So you could even say that pretending like the band was just on a hiatus, could have even given people some false hope. So, for better or for worse, inadvertently or advertently, Paul McCartney played a huge role in the breakup of the Beatles. And I think we can assume that he did so at least partially out of self-interest, which pushes his selfishness score out of the everyday zone and well into the upper numbers here. But being self-interested does not alone an asshole make. You must also be careless or stupid, depending on your definition. And Paul was also being careless, though not just because he knew he was risking the heartbreak of his millions of fans, not just because it would, affect everyone in the band financially, but because he was playing with his own reputation at the same time.
Well, why do you think Paul is leaving?
Do I have to say? He's not getting his own way. Maybe that's it. He likes his own way.
It's just too bad. A genius like that, the man that he once was.
McCartney would be lampooned for years as the stuffed shirt, greedy, selfish, power-hungry Beatle.
When the Beatles broke up, a lot of the talk was that I was the villain and that John and I didn't really get on well. And there was a lot of down talk about it because everyone was sad the Beatles had broken up.
The fallout of how the Beatles broke up changed how Paul was seen by the public. It changed how the band was seen by the public.
Why don't you just let him decide? If he wants to take LSD, he'll take it. He doesn't have to listen to you. You're not the boss of him.
Don't tell me what to say and what not to say, Paul McCartney.
I'm sick of you being so dark when I'm so impish and whimsical. I'm sick of it.
Hey, everyone. I've got a brand new mantra, Paul's a big fat cunt.
And now it's easy to say in hindsight that Paul made a big mistake by doing what he did. And no, he didn't hurt anybody, didn't kill anybody, but he did cost the heartbreak of millions and millions of people. That gets you up there on the careless side. McCartney made the breakup more sudden and more brutal for fans, and he did it in a way that hurt his own reputation and left a sour taste in the fans' mouths about the group as a whole. Those two things together could really get him all the way up into the near irredeemable territory up here in the eights, but his carelessness score is tempered by the fact that he was also famously right about famous piece of shit Alan Klein being a famous piece of shit. That drops his score well beneath the irredeemable line to a 7.2. So he does get a pretty high score on this one. Okay, but it doesn't cross the required 17-point threshold that a permanent asshole would get. And this wasn't a pure asshole move, right? That his stupidity and the selfishness did not equal out. They weren't the same. So overall, I would say that Paul McCartney was being a 15.2 level selfish asshole here, which is not enough to cross the permanent asshole line of 17 out of 20. I understand that people may be very upset with Paul about how the breakup of the Beatles played out, but I do not think he earns an irredeemable asshole status for it. That is to say, I don't think he's a permanent asshole. Yet. Asshole accusation number 2. Paul McCartney broke up Wings. On January 16th, 1980, Paul McCartney was arrested at Narita International Airport trying to smuggle nearly 8 ounces of high-potency Hawaiian cannabis into Japan.
I can see the guy opening my suitcase, and right on the top is this big bag of grass. And I didn't even put it in a sweater or hide it.
An eagle-eyed and eagle-nosed customs agent happened to notice the cartoonishly huge bag of weed near the top of Paul's suitcase, almost completely unhidden. McCartney was immediately detained, interrogated, and taken to the Tokyo Narcotics Detention Center, where he was placed in the general population as prisoner number 22. Paul had come to Japan with his band Wings for what would have been their 6th tour together. They were scheduled to play 11 gigs at venues in Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka, but Paul's arrest forced them to cancel the tour before it even got started. His fans were again devastated. The Japanese wing of the Wings fan club collected thousands of signatures calling for McCartney's release. And some ticket buyers even refused refunds, choosing instead to go to the Budokan on the nights of the scheduled performances as a form of protest. The British vice consul visited McCartney inside the detention center and told him that he faced up to 7 years hard labor in a Tokyo prison, away from his young wife and family.
I was in the place called the Tokyo Detention Center, and it wasn't fun at all. After about a couple of days of terror, where I didn't know anything, you start to get a bit of an idea of it. And I got a little bit indoctrinated and started to, it's like the Great Escape. You start to sort of play games and start to think, I've got to keep sane here.
I couldn't sleep for the first 3 days. It was 5 days before Linda was allowed to visit me, and I'd never spent a night apart from her since we'd married. It was pretty rough. Just a thin mattress on the floor. I had to wash using water from the toilet cistern. I had to share a bath with a bloke who was in for murder. I was afraid to take my suit off in case I got... But I'd seen all those prisoner of war movies, and I knew you had to keep your spirits up, so I'd organized sing-songs with the other prisoners.
If it had just been me, in a group or something, I don't think it would have been so bad. I took the wife and kids, like I always do. So Daddy got busted. Where's Daddy? It's gone away for the evening. So I was imagining Linda and the kids, a little house on the outskirts of Tokyo, the kids being brought up in Japanese schools.
Were you afraid they would set an example with you and actually put you in jail for 7 years?
Yeah, I was looking at my kids speaking Japanese and being brought up in Tokyo.
However, Paul has not always been so gloomy about his time inside. Here he tells a Japanese journalist just how much fun he had.
And I got good treatment. The Japanese people were really good, and the guards are in there. If any guards are watching, hello, man. Hi. Okay.
Okay, mate.
Yeah, they might be watching. Some of my friends, but it was okay.
I've heard you sang a song with the prisoners, some numbers and outside fans. Did you very enjoy and?
Well, I didn't enjoy it, because I don't think anybody enjoys being in jail. But we had some good times. Yeah, and I liked the other prisoners, Miss Saisu and Fujimoto.
But maybe that's just Paul being diplomatic again. Either way, what isn't disputed is that Paul was a model inmate, got up early, did all of his chores quickly, eagerly, and even allegedly wrote a song with his fellow inmates. So there's hope, did he? Remember, marijuana was not as widely kind of accepted as it is today back then, especially not in Japan, where the current punishment for marijuana possession is still 7 years. And that's now. And Paul had stuck like a half pound of super weed, the most potent weed on the planet, into his daughter's winter coat in 1980.
And there is a story people have put to me that I was framed, which actually makes more sense to me as time goes on, but I don't think I was.
Now, almost immediately afterwards, rumors began to swirl that it was the evil sorceress Yoko Ono who had tipped off the Japanese feds as to the possibility of Paul carrying marijuana with him into Japan. This theory is popular online and in a few tell-alls from Beatles hangers-on. I wasn't the only one who believed that Paul was set up by Yoko Ono. Not only was Yoko Japanese, she was from an influential and very wealthy banking family. Paul and Linda and everyone in the inner circle believed that Yoko had informed the Japanese police that Paul was more than likely to have marijuana in his luggage, even though Paul had been quite outspoken about his use of cannabis, and even though he may have been naive about getting caught, I think there had been some Japanese politics involved. Now, don't get me wrong, this is a solid theory. Yoko Ono was famously both alive and Japanese at the time of Paul's arrest. She can't hide that. And it's also very likely that the Japanese government, who she probably has a direct line to, would listen to a very, very weird performance artist who does stuff like this. Still, others feel that it could have been Paul McCartney's 3 previous arrests for marijuana possession that really started the suspicion rolling. This theory gains a bit more credibility when we find out that Japan had already revoked Paul's visa once before for growing marijuana on his farm in Scotland, which is a different country. That's how much Japan hates weed. And another thing helping this theory along is the fact that that's what Japan said. Japan made Paul McCartney jump through years of hoops to get back into their country, including forcing him to sign an affidavit swearing that he no longer even smoked marijuana at all. Japan essentially dared McCartney to bring marijuana into their country, and he obliged.
We'd been told, whatever we did, don't take it into Japan. Very severe penalties. And we fully thought we weren't going to. That's fine, we won't take it in. Well, for some reason, and I still can't explain, I took some in. And rather a large amount.
Well, no, in Japan, we were warned. They said, look, whatever you do, don't take part in. They said, you know what it's like in America? It's kind of, sort of loose attitude.
Right.
Britain, a bit looser. Don't go into Japan with it. It's 7 years hard labor.
After almost 10 days of incarceration, the Tokyo district prosecutor decided to simply deport McCartney back to the UK without charge or conviction, determining that the extreme loss of tour income, along with the international shame of the incident as a whole, were punishment enough. Basically, everyone saw it as a diplomatic necessity. Japan didn't want to lock up one of the world's most popular musicians. England didn't want to lose one of its best guys.
Does this now mean that you're going to give up marijuana smoking?
It looks like it.
Still, I love that Paul McCartney, who's the cheeky Liverpudlian, tried to get his deportation flight rerouted to Holland so he could get some weed. I don't know if that's true. I want to believe it's true. McCartney lost millions of dollars on the canceled tour dates. He was forced to repay the promoters out of his own pocket, and the incident began a process that would ultimately lead to the end of his band Wings.
I suddenly didn't have to do the tour. It was almost as if I wanted to get busted.
In multiple interviews and on multiple occasions, Paul McCartney has admitted that he was to blame for this entire fiasco.
And the terrible thing was, it was just stupid. I had some stuff, and it was just arrogant. I just thought, you know what, they'll never boss me.
And he even suggests that he had like a subconscious wish that the Japanese authorities would catch him, arrest him, and put him in prison to get him out of doing the tour.
Tell you the truth, I really don't know to this day what made me do it.
I think that it might have been that. There might have been something to do with that, because I was ready to get out of Wings. I think also, more importantly, we hadn't really rehearsed much for that tour, and I felt under-rehearsed. I cannot believe that I would have myself busted and put in jail 9 days just to get out of a group. I mean, let's face it, there are easier ways to do it than that. And also having to pay £1 million to the promoters in default, I think the only thing, it might have just been some deep psychological thing. It's a weird period for me. Now, I don't know if this is true. But the guy did bring half a pound of marijuana with him for a trip that was going to last about a week and a half.
And was it a lot of pot, or was it just...
It was way too much.
Really?
Honestly, I mean, and I got there, and I said, well, what's the thing? They said 7 years hard labor.
That would put him just over Wiz Khalifa on the pothead scale. And maybe Paul goes that hard. And maybe it was for the band, and maybe it was, too good to throw out, or it was just absent-minded, like rock star pothead behavior. And Paul McCartney has done other rock star pothead moves in his life. For example, this is not the only time he's been caught trying to smuggle drugs into a foreign country on vacation. On January 16th. That's right! Paul McCartney was arrested again on January 16th, 4 years later, for smuggling marijuana into Barbados.
Whatever you think and whatever you think I've done, this, I'm telling you, this substance, cannabis, is a whole lot less harmful than rum punch, whiskey, nicotine, and glue, all of which are perfectly legal.
He's right, There you go.
That time it was just like a small fine, not really a big deal. But getting arrested for drug smuggling on the same day, 4 years apart, is classic pothead maneuver. It really could have been an accident.
We were feeling like we'd done what we set out to do. And we're getting a little bit fed up of another lineup. Here we go, another dollar, another day. It started to just wind down the enthusiasm, I think.
But I think we should take McCartney at his word here. He was worried about the tour. He was worried about the band. He felt under-rehearsed. He didn't want to do those 11 shows. And maybe, getting arrested gets him out of that obligation. And now Paul admits that this was a dumb move. He lost a parent as a kid. He knows exactly the type of fear his kids were probably going through at the time.
I think I was just stupid. And I paid the penalty. Hey.
And Paul probably assumed that nothing was really going to happen to him, because he's such a beloved guy. But he still risked it all to avoid tough conversations. To me, that is a perfect asshole move, meaning it is equal parts selfish and careless. The stupidity of it enhanced how selfish it seemed, and how selfish it was enhanced how stupid it was. Not only was he terrifying his family, but he was also, again, terrifying his fans. But aside from that, the fallout fell mostly on McCartney himself in the form of embarrassment, and the embarrassment McCartney suffered was equal to the selfishness of taking a small forest of marijuana into Japan. This wasn't a nebulous series of events where there were multiple different people at fault in different ways. This was all Paul's fault, and so he gets all the blame. To me, that is a perfect asshole move, meaning it is equal parts selfish and careless. The selfishness and carelessness kind of enhance each other, enhancing the overall score. Because nobody was ultimately really hurt, Paul doesn't cross the irredeemable line here. He gets close, but he lives to fight another day. Accusation number 3. Paul McCartney was an asshole to John Lennon. This was Paul McCartney on December 9th, 1980, the day after John Lennon was shot and killed in New York.
Very shocked, It's terrible news. How did you find out about it? I got a phone call this morning. From whom? From a friend of mine.
Are you planning to go before the funeral?
I don't know yet.
Have you discussed the death with any of the other Beatles?
No.
Do you plan to?
Probably, yeah.
What were you recording today?
I was just listening to some stuff, I just didn't want to sit at home.
Why?
Oh, I didn't feel like it.
What time did you hear the news?
This morning sometime. Very early? Yeah. Don't know, yeah. Drag, isn't it?
Though it's short, it's one of the most famous, infamous interviews that McCartney has ever given. In a moment, McCartney emerges from his hotel, he confirms his knowledge of Lennon's murder, and then refuses to show any sign of grief or sadness at the tragic loss of his once best friend. He seems disconnected, disinterested, as if he were answering questions about another topic entirely. He gives a few short sentences to the reporter's questions and then exits the interview with the now famous parting line, drag, isn't it?
Drag, isn't it? Okay, cheers. Bye.
Even the journalist narrating this segment seems annoyed with McCartney.
A drag, how the world will see it, nor can there ever be any more talk of the Beatles getting together again.
It's important to set the context for people to understand. People were terribly confused and horrified by John Lennon's murder.
Thousands of people are gathering in Central Park to mark Lennon's death in the manner requested by the widow, Yoko Ono, with 10 minutes of silent prayer.
We ask for complete silence for this 10 minutes.
People gathered in parks and played Lennon's music. They wept. It was the first of its kind, of a celebrity like that just being gunned down, somebody that everybody loved just being murdered. It was one of the most traumatizing events of the 20th century, especially in music.
In Amsterdam yesterday, over 4,000 people stood outside the Amsterdam Hilton. In Toronto, 35,000 mourners stood in the cold, holding a candlelight vigil for John Lennon. They braved Toronto's snow and high winds to keep Lennon's spirit alive with his song, All You Need Is Love.
It remains an event surrounded by a great deal of confusion and pain and trauma for people. I remember being upset by it, learning about it 10 years or longer after it happened when I was a kid. I've lost members of my family before. You probably have too. And that's what it felt like to lose Lennon. But it felt like you'd lost somebody very close to you because his music was so intimate and close to people. That was the mood. That was the feeling. Utter devastation. And then here comes Paul McCartney.
The man who wrote hundreds of songs with Lennon seems stunned.
Very shocked, It's terrible news.
Kind of stone-faced, cold, unwilling to offer any meaning or condolence or unwilling to, even show any emotion at all. Just giving us the same classic, calm, pleasant Paul. At that time, Paul and John were rumored to be in a big feud with each other. These rumors were primarily fueled by Lennon's now infamous 1971 interview with Jan Wenner.
I thought Paul's was rubbish, but I thought that first one was just a load of, I told you, light and whatever, that crack.
John was furious with Paul and George and everyone else at Apple and in the Beatles studios for how they apparently treated Yoko.
Like Peter Brown in our office, and you can put this in. After we come back from 6 months, he comes down and shakes my hand and doesn't even say hello to her. Now that's going on all the time, and we get in so much pain that we have to do something about it,
Even suggesting vaguely that it might have been Paul's fault that he started doing heroin.
We took H because of what the Beatles and their pals were doing to us.
And his song How Do You Sleep?
The only thing you done was...
For his part, Paul McCartney wrote Too Many People, at least partially about John.
That was your first mistake.
Too Many People. This song was written a year or so after the Beatles breakup, at a time when John was firing missiles at me with his songs, and one or two of them were quite cruel. I don't know what he hoped to gain, other than punching me in the face. The whole thing really annoyed me. I decided to turn my missiles on him too, but I'm not really that kind of writer, so it was quite veiled. It was the 1970s equivalent of what we might today call a diss track. The first verse and the chorus had pretty much all the anger I could muster, and when I did the vocal on the second line, Too Many Reaching for a Piece of Cake, I remember singing it as Piss Off Cake, which you can hear if you really listen to it. You took your lucky break and broke it in two. You've made this break, so good luck with it. Again, I was getting back at John, but my heart wasn't really in it. I didn't really come out with any savagery. It's actually a fairly upbeat song. It doesn't really sound that vitriolic. If you didn't know the story, I don't know that you'd be able to guess at the anger behind his writing. It was all a bit weird and a bit nasty, and I was basically saying, let's be sensible. We had a lot going for us in the Beatles, and what actually split us up is the business stuff. And that's pretty pathetic, really. So let's try and be peaceful. It seemed to me they were all just fucking out of it and making no attempt to do anything sensible. A lot of hurt went down during that period in the early 1970s. Them feeling hurt, me feeling hurt. But John being John, he was the one who would write a hurtful song. That was his bag.
John was also furious about the way the original Let It Be film turned out.
I felt sad, also felt that film was set up by Paul, for Paul. That's one of the main reasons the Beatles ended, because I can't speak for George, but I pretty damn well know. We got fed up of being sidemen for Paul. After Brian died, that's what began to happen to us, And the camera work was set up to show Paul and not to show anybody else, and that's how I felt about it. And on top of that, the people that cut it as Paul is God and we're just lying around there, and that's what I felt. And I knew there were some shots of Yoko and me that had been just chopped out of the film for no other reason than the people were oriented towards Engelbert Humperdinck.
For clarification here, John is not talking about Engelbert Humperdinck, the German composer who wrote Hansel and Gretel. He is talking about the English pop icon Arnold Dorsey, who took the stage name Engelbert Humperdinck in the 60s and wrote a number of very safe, very placid ballads that Lennon felt epitomized the banality of Muzak and bland pop.
Please don't cry.
Engelbert Humperdinck was about the worst thing Lennon could call you.
Yeah, well, when some of the world's greatest entertainer calls you Engelbert Humperdinck, you get feelings of something. And I always felt guilty.
And throughout the 70s, John and Paul were battling in court over their financial relationship and their relationship to Apple. And many people, probably most people, thought that they were still feuding at the time of Lennon's tragic murder. And this is actually what I thought for years. And I think a lot of people thought that too, is that John and Paul hated each other and, hadn't talked in years. But that is actually not true. According to both of them, they'd revitalized their friendship only a few years after the Beatles broke up.
Why did I write How Do You Sleep?
How Do You Sleep?
Yeah,
what he said? All right.
Why did I write it? Well, I don't have a reason for writing.
Beautiful song.
It's a good song. Like the Elephant's Memory Group was playing with me, said we must do it. And I said we can't do it because they all only think of it as being in reference to Paul. Well, we think of it as a good guitar solo. And I was answering a few little messages that Paul sent to me on RAM. You see, a little what?
Vindictive.
Well, it's an answer. Paul personally doesn't feel as though I insulted him or anything because I had dinner with him last week. He's quite happy,
and they were swearing at each other.
If I can't have a fight with my best friend, I don't know who I can have a fight with.
Is he your best friend, Paul?
I guess in the male sex he was. I don't know about now.
He and I eventually made it up. I used to phone him in New York, after all the arguments were over, and we got to be friends again, and it was nice. Long distance friends, but it was still friends.
They were clearly no longer as close as they once were. That's, I think, probably what really pissed people off, is that they'd grown up a bit, that they had changed a bit, and they'd grown apart a little bit. And that's kind of what happens to people sometimes. It doesn't mean that they become enemies. It doesn't mean that they're feuding. Yes, John very publicly trashed Paul early on in interviews and in songs. But he was always incredibly defensive if anybody else tried to trash Paul. Here's the thing about them. When they were after each other's throats, when it came to the breakup and all that stuff, if anybody in the Vampires back in those days, that was our drinking club, if anybody said anything bad about Paul, John would take a swing at you because that was his best friend. If anybody said anything about John to Paul, Paul would walk out of the room. He'd just walk out because you are not allowed to talk about their best friends. They were best friends, no matter what was going on in the whole thing. It was framed as this big feud, but in reality, they still loved each other. They were still brothers. In 1974, Paul and Linda met with Yoko Ono while John was in Los Angeles with May Pang, and their marriage was falling apart.
I was telling you about the marriage thing. When they broke up, Yoko came through London and visited us, which was very nice, and Linda and I just got married just a bit before. We were living in this big sort of old house in St. John's Wood. And Yoko came by and we started talking. Obviously the important subject for us is what's happened. You've broken up then, you know, you're here, he's there. What's happened? And she was very nice and confided in us that, yeah, you know, it's kind of broken up. But she was being very strong about it, but very, not feminist, but being a strong woman rather than just submitting to it all. And she said, no, he's got to work his way back. If he's to get back with me, I can't just go. And she couldn't, which is good, you know. I mean, I think she would be mad to just go and prostrate herself at his feet kind of thing. But she said, no, he's going to have to work it. And I said, well, look, I mean, if I see him, are you still in love? Do you still sort of love him? She said, yeah. I said, well, would you think it was an intrusion if I kind of said to him, look, man, she loves you, and there's a way to get back, and you can. Sounds like Beatles songs. It sounds like those. I send all my loving from me to you. And I said this to Yoko. I said, would that be okay? Would you hate that? But you know, we might see him around. So I would like to be a mediator in this because I think the two of you, obviously got something pretty strong going. And she said she didn't mind.
Then the next day, Paul went to Los Angeles, met with John, and told him what they had been talking about with Yoko. Now, at this time, Lennon was actually miserable. As much as he was kind of partying, gallivanting, and carousing, he was rudderless. He needed Yoko Ono back in his life.
We went out to visit them and they were doing Pussycats. And it was weird, kind of just meet and everything. But then I just said to John, he was in the house with Nielsen, Jesse, Keith Moon, and a few of the guys. And they were all, it was a pretty crazed house there. You know, you hear some of the stories come out of that house. And, it was pretty wild days. And I said to him, hey, come on, come here. Come in the back room, I want to talk to you private. So we went in the back room and I sat him down privately and I said, look, I feel a bit like a matchmaker here, but this girl of yours, she really still loves you. Do you love her? Because I felt like a judge or somebody, you know, in a divorce court, you know, divorce settlement. And he said, yeah, I do. He said, but I don't know what to do. And I said, well, I'll talk to her. So she does still love you, but you're going to have to work your little ass off, man. You have to get back to New York. You have to take a separate flat. You have to send her roses every fucking day. You have to work at it like a bitch, and you just might get her back. Which is sort of what he did.
Paul McCartney was the go-between for John and Yoko at the most vulnerable time in their marriage. I don't believe what we're seeing in the drag video is a man without emotion. I believe it's a man overcome by it. Yeah, he's being nonchalant, but that's who Paul McCartney is. He's never been chalant. McCartney can't be chalant. I don't think it makes him a sociopath or a psychopath or anything like that. And frankly, if he had come out there and tried to do some big performative display of grief or turned the moment into something, you know, really about him, that would have been even more crass and suspicious to me. I think Paul McCartney was probably just in shock.
When John died, it was so difficult. It was difficult for everyone in the world because he was such a loved character and such a crazy guy, you know, that he was so special. And so it had hit me so much so that I couldn't really talk about it. And I remember getting home from the studio on the day that we'd heard the news he died and turning the TV on and seeing people say, well, John Lennon was this and what he was this. And I remember meeting him then, and it was like, I don't know, I can't be one of those people. I can't just go on TV and say what John meant to me. It was just too deep. it's just too much. I couldn't put it into words.
And frankly, I don't consider this moment to really even register on the asshole chart at all. If you want to see a real video about how Paul McCartney felt about John Lennon, watch this one.
So to sort of sum up the whole thing, I've chosen one off John Lennon's record Double Fantasy, which I think is a beautiful song. It's very moving to me. Anyway, so I'd just like to sum the whole thing up by playing a song called Beautiful Boy.
The world lost an icon when Lennon died, but Paul McCartney lost a brother. And sure, he's lobbed some passive-aggressive jabs at Lennon over the years, and Lennon certainly got him back, usually twice as hard. I think you could say they were both assholes to each other over the years in different ways, but this particular moment is not evidence of any sort of inherent assholishness on McCartney's part at all. Asshole accusation number 4. Paul was secretly an asshole to Yoko Ono. Now, Yoko and Paul have had multiple moments of tension between them. In fact, there even seems to be like a question about how she came to meet the Beatles and know them in the first place.
You were a Beatles fan before, or would you say you were a Lennon fan before?
Neither.
Neither. Didn't care for either of them?
She didn't know about it. The only name she knew was Ringo, because it means apple in Japanese.
Yes, I knew the Beatles as a social phenomenon, but I was into, well, I come from Sarah Lawrence, and they were playing jazz, and, you know, it was like that. So pop music, I wasn't really into it.
When you met Yoko, she claimed she didn't know who the Beatles were, but meanwhile, she knew who the Beatles were because
met him.
She met you.
Yeah, well, you know, the thing is, I have like my version of the story.
What is your version?
My version is that we were in London and Yoko came round to my house knocking on the door. Someone said there's this Japanese lady outside there. I said, okay, let her in. In those days, you know, people who came around like that, I was living on my own, so I would just say, well, come on in, have a cup of tea, we'll have a talk.
Right. So this is before Linda, you're single.
Yeah.
And Yoko knocks on the door.
My recollection, you know, against the allegation, is that she came in and she said, it's John Cage's birthday and us artists want to collect a bunch of manuscripts to give him for his, whatever it was, 60th or something birthday.
Right.
And I thought immediately, I don't really want to do this.
Right.
I thought, but because I don't like to give away the stuff, I like to keep that stuff where we wrote, you know, yesterday on the back of an envelope.
Right. In other words, you don't auction that stuff off and stuff like that. You say, hey, I wrote this, I want to own it.
You know, give it to my kids maybe or something. You know?
Means something to you.
So I wasn't that keen to give it away. But I just thought, you said, but my friend John might.
Right.
And that's my recollection that I then said, and he lives here, and she went to see him.
Did she offer herself to you sexually?
No.
She did not. Did you get the impression that she was there in order to score a Beatle, so to speak?
No, I didn't. It was all above board.
You're saying that with a smile.
That there was she knew of the Beatles.
I don't know. You know,
of course. I mean, if she knocked on your door, she knew you were a Beatle.
And if she wanted a manuscript of what? Of John Doe?
Now, as much as I don't care about this he said, she said situation with all its salaciousness, I do think it emphasizes something about who Yoko Ono is. I think John and Yoko enjoyed creating myth. I think Yoko was really making more of a statement about how she didn't like pop music and that she didn't care about pop culture and didn't care about like Lennon's fame and celebrity. Both she and Lennon really enjoyed the fact that she came from experimental music scene, which was a totally different scene that Lennon came from and was kind of unaware of their fame, even though she probably was aware of it. The dime store psychologist in me is like, John Lennon is surrounded by fame, he's surrounded by sycophants, and here is a woman who is not a sycophant. I think that was appealing to him. But regardless, Paul has said that there were tensions with Yoko at the beginning of their relationship because of the fact that, you know, she was a woman.
The song Get Back, when you were recording it, Yoko was in the studio. And every time you sang Get Back, John accused you of staring at Yoko. And he took it as an insult.
Those were very paranoid times.
I know.
And let's face it, we didn't welcome Yoko in the studio.
I know.
Because we thought it was a guy thing. Yes. I mean, even the guys' wives and the girlfriends and stuff weren't really welcome in the studio. They could, you know, control room for a quick visit.
Right.
But actually sit in the studio with us, it was like, no, excuse me, we're working.
Did you have the guts to say that to John?
No.
You did not. If you had said that...
It was kind of obvious, though.
Yes, but weren't you acting out passive-aggressively? You're sitting in the studio, you're just steaming. Rather than saying, John, in a kind of a loving way, this is hurting me. I can't work this way to have someone observing. Everyone was just kind of sniping.
We were just fuming.
Right.
Well,
and sulking and being kind of,
Did John ever say, look, I'm bringing... He didn't ask permission to do it.
No, he didn't. The thing is, it was really just the initial shock of Yoko sitting on one of the amps.
Right.
Excuse me, that's my amp.
Yeah.
She couldn't use a stool.
Oh, I think it would be mind-blowing, Paul.
It was mind-blowing. But later on, we suddenly sort of thought, you know what? John's in love with this girl. If he wants to bring in the studio, we've got to cope with that. And we learned to cope with it. And, I now feel that he had the right to do that. It might have been better if he'd been a little bit more diplomatic and sort of said, hey, guys, I'd love her to be, I really love her and I just want to be near her all the time.
Right.
But we had to figure that out. And we did eventually, but it took some time. And there was a few... looks went on.
It's important to mention here that when the Beatles finally did break up, the headline in the Daily Mail was Yoko caused breakup, says Beatle Paul. But in reality, the article only mentions that Yoko's arguments with George Harrison were a problem in the studio. That's quite a distance from causing the breakup. Now, all the amateur psychologists out there can assume that Paul was upset at Yoko because John was replacing Paul with Yoko. It could be true. I don't know. But what is definitely true is that John wasn't just bringing his girlfriend around the studio. He was bringing someone who literally rejected the Beatles' entire musical style, their whole musical aesthetic. Yoko Ono does not like pop music. She's made that clear. And she doesn't like the Beatles.
And he kind of showed me like Yellow Submarine and a few other songs, the lyrics, I thought it was kind of simplistic, But still I felt that the music, the structure of music, the form of music was a little bit too simplistic. The chords and, the beat is always the same,
And Paul McCartney is pop music. He is Mr. Pop Music. He has the most pop music hits ever. And Yoko Ono's idea of a good song is like, like screaming the alphabet into a frying pan or something. And no hate, everybody sing how you want. Honestly, she is a very innovative musician and producer. She is huge in the experimental world. So the idea that Yoko Ono is some sort of hanger-on to the Beatles is actually really different than reality. She was herself a musical force at that time and still is. But add to this mixture the fact that John had just gotten a divorce from his first wife, Cynthia, who was like a blonde-haired, blue-eyed English woman. And now he was with Yoko Ono, who looked and acted very different and who the public largely despised.
Well, I've been blamed, I don't know, maybe 30, 40 years now.
You were aware of that going on? You were aware that's what people were saying?
I was fully aware of it because it was like they was jabbing me all the time.
Yoko was the victim of constant racist taunts and conspiracy theories about how, she tricked John and fooled him into being with her. And all of this comes into the studio with her. So I don't doubt that Paul was annoyed at her being there. Now, John said that Paul and George were rude to Yoko when she first came.
You can quote Paul, you can look at it in the papers. He says many times that first he hated Yoko and then he got to like her. It's too late for me, and for Yoko, why should she take that kind of shit from those people? They're writing about her looking miserable and let it be. You sit through 60 sessions with the most big-headed, uptight people on earth and see what it's fucking like and be insulted by it just because you love someone. That's... And George was insulted her right to her face in Apple office at the beginning, just being straightforward. That game of, well, I'm going to be up front because this is what I've heard. And Dylan and a few people said you've got a lousy name in New York and you give off bad vibes. That's what George said to her. And we both sat through it. And I didn't hit him. I don't know why. But I was always hoping that they'd come round. I couldn't believe it, And they all sat there with their wires like a fucking jury and judged us.
And Paul freely admits that he didn't like Yoko when she first arrived, that he thought she was a, quote, hard woman.
I thought she was a hard woman. I don't think she is now. I think she's just the opposite. I think she's a very loving, caring woman. I thought she was pushy, which I think's wrong. I don't think she is. I think she's just herself. She's determined more than some other people to be herself. Some people will just give in.
But at the same time, even in the Get Back documentary, Paul seems open to the idea that this is the love of John's life and that the world should respect that.
See, but their point is that they're trying to like be as near together as they can. They want to stay together, those two. So it's all right, let the young lovers stay together. But it's not that bad, you know. We got a lot out of people. So that I think John's saying now, obviously it came to a push between Yoko and the Beatles. It's Yoko, you know.
And while there are some clips online that try to make it look like Paul is being mean or condescending to Yoko, I frankly just don't see it. Especially since Yoko was taking a strongly antagonistic stance towards the Beatles' music, I really just don't see anything beyond basic asshole levels here, if that. But this was not the only time that Yoko and Paul had conflict. In the late 70s, early 80s, Yoko, George, and Ringo decided to sue EMI and Capitol Records for $45 million, claiming that they'd pocketed royalties belonging to the Beatles. Paul refused to join the suit initially because he had already negotiated a new contract for himself that paid him a much larger portion of his royalties as a solo artist. But it left the other Beatles kind of out in the cold, and they felt they needed Paul if they were going to get their 45 milli from Capitol. So all the Beatles together, including Yoko, joined legal forces and issued a summons against Paul, which essentially threatens to sue him before actually going through with it. It basically says if he doesn't join the Beatles lawsuit against Capitol, she will sue him. And Paul eventually capitulated and joined them. But it took, legal action to get it done.
That's what everyone seems to think. Yoko and I are sort of at war, I think it's based on events of the last kind of 10 years.
So again, this is not a huge asshole move to me. Yes, Paul needed to be sued into helping his bandmates, but he'd also spent years of his life and millions of dollars to get himself out of his Apple contract, specifically so that this wouldn't happen to him. And then he decided to take part in the lawsuit anyway. So this is not, to me, a major asshole move. Fast forward to 1995, Paul asks Yoko if he can change the writing credit on his song Yesterday from the Lennon-McCartney to his preferred McCartney-Lennon for their upcoming anthology series, and Yoko refused.
Yeah, that's one of my sort of problems. That's probably one of the reasons we don't have a great relationship. What I wanted to do was, after 30 years of always having John's name in front on this one song Yesterday, but people were kind of splitting it up and saying Yesterday, written by John Lennon and Paul McCartney. And I just said, could we just, on this one album, could we just switch it? So he said, written by Paul McCartney and John Lennon.
And she said no.
And yeah, for one reason or another, she said no, and it got into
Paul's
being
the only one on the record. He's the only one singing on that song.
I mean, maybe your point is, listen, who knows who wrote what, and if we start changing this song, what if we change the other ones? Maybe that was her point, but it would have been a nice gesture to you.
Exactly.
But at the same time, Yoko had already done this herself by removing Paul's name from a version of Give Peace a Chance, which she had written with Lennon in 1969. Now, fast forward to 2002, Paul credits 19 songs on his Back in the U.S. Live 2002 box set as being written by Paul McCartney and John Lennon, instead of the agreed-upon Lennon-McCartney. Yoko was not happy, but she didn't actually sue. I actually don't think Paul is way out of line here on this one either. Early on, John and Paul did write songs together, but that ended relatively quickly, and it stopped making that much sense to share credit on songs that they wrote individually. They chose the Lennon-McCartney thing because it looked good, because it sounded good, and because it was like Rodgers and Hammerstein or something like that. But ultimately, he found he wanted to take the credit for the songs that he wrote as a Beatle. That is not really an asshole-ish impulse in my view, especially as a musician, and I think people look at it and they say, oh, it's kind of, greedy, or it makes him look like he just wants credit for all this stuff and that he's kind of being shallow in retrospect. But none of these rises, again, above a 5 for me. Nothing that would warrant people saying Paul was extra rude or callous towards Yoko. Now, of course, they had also clashed about the use of the song Revolution in a Nike ad.
How much did it bother you when Revolution was used to sell Nike sneakers and things like that?
Heaps. It was, I'll tell you why. You see, with the Beatles, we had all those offers. Anybody who publishes songs, you get those offers. Hey, can we use this commercial? We had the offers from the big soft drinks companies. You know who I'm talking about. Big, huge offers to use a Beatles song, to use this and that. But we always turned them down because we believed it'd devalue the whole thing.
we'd be seen to be selling out, which we were keen not to do. You know, we kind of felt that our fans believed in us and that we owed them some sort of integrity. We talked to them. We knew what they thought of us, you know. So something like Revolution, you know, it meant more than a pair of sneakers.
But Paul was frankly right about that. Nike. In fact, it shows that he has standards for how John's work is portrayed in media. And Yoko weirdly approved the ad before she became critical of it later. And finally, Paul and Yoko have made up. They are no longer legal adversaries, and they seem to have buried all the hatchets in their past.
John, no matter what people thought of him from minute to minute, was a very, very beautiful person. And it's an honor to be able to do this with Yoko and Sean.
May I say this, that I really think it's grand that he's come here, and I'm very happy about that, and I think that Joe would have been very pleased.
Paul also came out and cleared the air about whether or not Yoko really did break up the Beatles.
Paul McCartney came out and cleared the air a little bit.
Well, you know, we know each other for such a long time, and he's a very sensitive and intelligent guy, so...
But looking back on all the litigation, for all the lawsuits and all the legal jockeying and the power struggles at Apple and all the stuff between Paul and Yoko, Paul got a reputation for all of his legal maneuvering. He got a reputation as being at odds with Yoko. He's had to deal with the questions his entire life. The whole thing blew up into this giant feud, which was like supposed to be an extension of the feud he had with John. So when we consider all the litigation, all the public, financial, and legal feuding that Paul was party to, I think he gets a cumulative score of 6.2. And it's pure because the mild selfishness of being so litigious, often for valid reasons, is directly proportional to the negative press that being in so many public conflicts gets you. It is a famous thing about Paul, and when people talk about his assholishness, they talk about this, but it does not actually cross the irredeemable asshole line. So while Paul may have been an asshole at times regarding Yoko Ono and dealing with her, I don't think it earns him the permanent asshole marker. Number 5, Paul was secretly an asshole to George Harrison. One crazy thing to think about when you're watching the Peter Jackson documentary on the Beatles is just how young they were back then. George Harrison is 25 years old at this time. You're still just learning who you are at 25, and all the Beatles were clearly in that period of their lives during that time. When they started, George was like 14 years old. He was taken to Hamburg, Germany, and thrown into the whiskey bar and the late night club scene and the prostitutes and the coke and the speed and all the craziness at the time. John Lennon was like a pig in shit in Germany. He loved all that debauchery. But George was kind of quiet. He was younger. He was more reserved. And he looked up to Paul McCartney, who was a little older than he was, and as sort of a mentor or an older brother type figure.
I met him. He used to get on the bus, the stop after I did. It was about a half an hour ride into this school. So if we ever sat next to each other, we would just develop our friendship and started talking about guitars. So then we learned chords off each other.
A few years later, he was actually George's best man at his wedding to Pattie Boyd. But as they got older, their friendship changed. According to George, the dynamic went from Paul being a kind of caring older brother type figure who gave George advice and encouragement to a dynamic where Paul was critical and kind of gatekeeping. My problem was that it would always be very difficult to get in on the act because Paul was very pushy in that respect. When he succumbed to playing on one of your tunes, he'd always do good. But you'd have to do 59 of Paul's songs before he'd even listen to one of yours. Like he were a more senior member of the band than George was. Now, partly that is because Paul was a more senior member of the band. As much as it was all for one and one for all, Paul and John's work made up the bulk of the Beatles' output. Their songs were prioritized. In fact, it's easy to forget now, but George was not really even widely regarded as in the same league as Lennon and McCartney until 1969, when he got both Here Comes the Sun and Something on Abbey Road. We always carved the singles up between us. We have the singles marked. We could have given him a lot of B-sides, but because we were two people, you had the A-side and I had the B-side. Well, the thing is, Paul answered, without even looking at George, who sat a few feet away, I think that until now, until this year, our songs have been better than George's. Now, this year, his songs are at least as good as ours. George was quick to correct Paul. Now, that's a myth. Because most of the songs this year I wrote about last year or the year before anyway. Maybe now I just don't care whether you were going to like them or not. I just do them. If I didn't get a break, I wouldn't push it. I just forget about it. Now for the last 2 years at any rate, I've pushed it a bit more. I know what he's saying, John said, because people have said to me, you're coming through a lot stronger now than you had. I don't particularly seek acclaim, George said. That's not the thing. It's just to get out whatever is there to make way for whatever else is there. You know, because it's only to get them out. And also I might as well make a bit of money seeing as I'm spending as much as the rest of you, and I don't earn as much as the rest of you. Like the others, George was now on his own musically. Most of my tunes, he said, I never had the Beatles backing me. Until that point, George had written big songs, but apparently neither Paul or John felt that he was up to their level yet.
Over the years, I had such a lot of songs mounting up that I really wanted to do, but I only got my quota of 1 or 2 tunes per album. Mm-hmm. And that way I would have had to have recorded about 100 Beatle albums just to get out the tunes I had in 1965.
Were you held down by the other fellas?
Well, very subtly, yes.
Yeah? How would they
not
do
really,
it? I mean,
they didn't strap me down or anything like that.
Yeah.
But no, it was just the way things happened, It started off I didn't write, they wrote, then I started to write, and it was sort of trying to push in a bit.
Because George was supposed to have resented you for always getting on his back.
He did resent it. But you see, for instance, 2 examples. One, on Abbey Road, I was beginning to get too producery for everyone. George Martin was the actual producer, and I was beginning to sort of be too definite. And George and Ringo turned around and said, oh, look, piss off. We're fed up. Just back off. We're fine, we're grown-ups, and we can do it without you, fine. So I kind of go, oh, one of those people like me who don't realise when they're being overbearing. It can be it can become as a great surprise to actually be told you are overbearing, So I completely clammed up and sort of backed off and sort of went, right, okay, I'm burned. Back off. They're right. I'm a turd. Sit here, fine. Okay, guys. So a day or so went by, 2 days, and the session started to flag a bit. Ringo eventually turned and said, come on, produce, come on. And so it was like, you couldn't have it both ways, You either had to have me doing what I did, which, let's face it, I hadn't done too bad, or I was going to back off and become paranoid myself, which is what happened. There's a lot of Wings was to do with that.
The really crazy thing about George and Paul was that they were ever able to be in a band together at all. They are 2 very different kinds of musicians. Paul is pop music.
So live and let die.
They both love rock and roll, and they both make pop music, but Paul's songs are often more upbeat. They're lyrically less severe. They're silly love songs, as he says. They don't often have like an overarching message or an ideology underpinning their lyrics. Whereas George's lyrics are deeply personal and deeply religious. Music was an exercise of the soul for George.
Ah, sweet Lord, I really want to see you.
I'm unhappy about the world being concreted over and all the forests chopped down and the air polluted, and the fact that the planet is in the control of mad people. I'm very unhappy about that, but I have a long-term view, which is all things must pass.
Harrison joined Lennon on How Do You Sleep. He spoke negatively about Paul in a number of interviews, and even kind of mocked him when refused to show up with him and Ringo to the Beatles Hall of Fame induction, due to the ongoing royalty dispute that had been going on between him and the other Beatles.
It is unfortunate Paul's not here because he was the one who had the speech in his pocket.
Are you saddened that Paul McCartney wasn't able to appear?
For him, it's a pity he missed it because he would have had a good time. And it was nice to see people saying, well, after all that we've done, that's all it was, really. Get the lads here, give them a pat on the back and give them the medal. And it's a shame he missed it because he contributed so much to it, but it didn't spoil our night. We still had fun without him.
Have you been able to have any reconciliation with Paul since that particular event?
Oh, he's okay, yeah. He's okay. He just was trying to use that situation for some personal motive that he had, and it just didn't work. But, we're long past all the squabbles now.
Yeah, well, now we don't have any problems whatsoever as far as being people is concerned. And it's quite nice to see him. But I don't know about being in a band with him, how that would work out. It's like, we all have our own tunes to do.
period of time when Paul and I didn't get on very well, but we're great friends now, and I think, time slips away, and we realize that it sort of comes back. I met Paul when I was 13 years old or 12 years old, at school. There's much more fun, good experiences that we've shared than the bad ones. Paul and I are good friends now. The next stage is if we can pick up a couple of guitars and sing a few old Buddy Holly tunes together. Who knows, we may be able to knock out a tune or two. And if we can get that far, then, what's to stop us? It would never be anything like some great big reunion album or concert. I think we're past that stage. We're just thankful to be able to be friendly, and if we can actually produce a tune or something, that's a nice little song, that would be enough.
And I actually think one of the most endearing videos of Paul that I've ever seen is the video of him greeting George here.
Hello, Neil. How are you? Hello, George. Nice to see you. Nice. Hello, vegetarian leather jacket. Yeah? Yes.
I really think you can tell that Paul has no idea he's on camera here until he sees the camera. And you kind of get a glimpse of his, his real side, his behind the scenes side, the one he kind of hides from the public. I'm not sure why. It seems very endearing, but clearly Paul was not being a big enough asshole to keep him and George from being friends. But it was clear that the two never became very close again. George had many famous friendships in the rock world. Paul seemed to be less invited into those spaces. He wasn't best friends with Clapton or Harry Nilsson or Bob Dylan or any of those guys. Anyway, that's gossipy bullshit. It's not about being in the cool kids club, whatever you're doing. What's notable though is that Paul and George only really reunited to work on the Beatles anthology in the 90s. Yes, again, he ultimately turned out to be right about the, famous piece of shit Alan Klein being a famous piece of shit.
Can you tell me what happened with Alan Klein? Why did you and the other two try to decide finally to get rid of him?
Well, there are many reasons to finally give him the push, although I don't want to go into the details of it. Let's say that possibly Paul's suspicions were right, and the time was right.
But Paul was wrong about George's songs. George's album, All Things Must Pass, was a masterpiece and widely considered one by the critics. Critics adored his work. George became the first Beatle to have a solo #1 single in both the UK and America with My Sweet Lord. George released 15 singles on the Hot 100 list during his solo career, including 5 top 10 hits. It's not as many as Paul, sure, but it's nothing to sneeze at, folks. Most musicians are happy just to get one on a list at all. So just in an A&R sense, just from a producer's point of view, it was a careless decision to not hear George out more, to not let him spread his wings a little bit more on the album. Most bands don't even have one musical genius, let alone 2. But who's going to guess that 3 of the greatest songwriters of the 20th century are going to be in the same band? Paul was like, there's no way there's a third genius in this band. So once again, Paul's asshole score is pure. Paul gets a 7.2 for this particular infraction, but because it's pure, we add a 0.5 to the total score, meaning Paul's total asshole liability for being an asshole to George is 14.9 pure. So, Paul McCartney has not crossed the irredeemable asshole line. Yes, he gets pretty close a few times, but he was never really violent or hateful or anything like that. But he did let his ego make some pretty huge mistakes that ultimately caused a great deal of grief and sadness. Number 6. The real reason people don't like Paul McCartney. I've talked a lot about the Peter Jackson documentary, the Get Back documentary, the fly on the wall in the studio with the Beatles thing. For a Beatles fan, it was kind of too good to be true. It kind of offered a certain kind of closure to people about the end of the Beatles that I think had been missing from the Beatles story. Beatles fandom essentially had this very tumultuous idea of the end of the Beatles. It's what led people to believe that John and Paul hated each other until the end of John's life, and the idea that Paul is this evil, conniving villain type of person. But seeing the Beatles in that environment just reminded people that these guys were just like friends once. Yes, Paul was being demanding. Yes, he was pushing the others to do this concert and this studio album and the rooftop concert, and then he wanted to do like a club tour. Paul wanted to go like full steam ahead, churning out hit after hit every year like they had been. As a solo artist, Paul has released 26 studio albums, 4 compilations, 9 live albums, 37 video albums, 2 plays, 111 singles, 7 classical albums, 5 electronica albums, 5 box sets, and 79 music videos. Paul McCartney likes to work.
The work must still be important, though, to you. Well, I just like it, you know. It just is. It's sort of like a hobby to me.
You know, we have to thank Paul for the amount of music we put out, because he's the workaholic.
Right.
John and I would be sitting in the garden and the phone would ring and we'd say, we know it's him. We just knew by the ring. He wants to go to work.
Yeah.
Hey, should we go in the studio, lads?
Right.
And that's what we do.
So he was the motivating force.
He was.
Right.
This did used to, I'm sure it did piss people off, and much as I try to not piss people off, obviously if you are, I don't know, driving force, overbearing, whatever you want to call it, if you are on the ball, a perfectionist, whatever, it can annoy some people.
He likes to be producing. He's like Prince or Zappa or any number of composers who are essentially always on to the next project, always creating the next thing. Yes, there was a competition between him and John about, you know, who was the leader of the band, but the movie kind of even settles that.
None of us could actually say anything about your arrangements because you rejected all of it.
Yes, sure.
And so George and I were just, you know, like you do about me. Yeah. You know, I'm going about, and a lot of the times you're right. And a lot of the times you're the same as you as well. But I can't see the answer to that.
You've always been boxed. You have been sort of second guess. But not always. Not always.
John was cool and aloof and over it. He was the leader of the Beatles without even really having to try. Paul may have eventually become the head administrator, but musically, where John went, the others follow. You know, it seemed effortless to him. Paul was the opposite. He's always had to try so hard and work so hard and continued to produce. Paul's the business guy, the money guy. In reality, over the years, I think people have just said, you know, Paul McCartney just isn't as cool as John Lennon. His songs are too poppy, his melodies are too kind of upbeat and positive, and all of his songs are silly love songs. There's actually a quote from Rob Sheffield's incredible book, Dreaming of the Beatles. Paul is the most Beatlesque of the Beatles. If you dislike the Beatles, it's because you dislike Paul. If you love them despite their flaws, you mean Paul's flaws. If they're overrated, it's because Paul's overrated. Whatever problem you have with the Beatles, it's Paul's fault. That's fine. It's the essence of Paulness. You can't really love Paul without facing the question of why people have such toxic feelings about him. Paul is the only Beatle anyone bothers to hate. He's the one to bring up if you're looking to start an argument. He's the most mysterious and disturbing figure in the story. Tell me you're Paul McCartney and I will tell you who you are. He was the Beatle who worked harder, got to the studio earlier, nagged them into writing their songs. He was the boss bitch who flogged 3 other men to live out the Beatle fantasy after it stopped meaning that much to them. He was the only one who never quit, right up until 1970. And then, of course, he was the one who had to quit in a big hissy fit, whereas the others exited so discreetly that nobody found out until he coaxed them back. He never found it a drag to be a Beatle, never seemed to notice that for the others, he was the drag. I recently heard Casey Kasem on a vintage American top 40 from 1974, introducing a Wings song. Here's the man who plays guitar with his left hand and counts his money with his right. When Casey Kasem is giving you shade, you have officially convinced the world you're fair game. Paul has a compulsive need to feed his enemies all the ammunition they could want. The software of don't take the bait was never installed in his system. No celebrity has ever been easier to goad into gaffes. I love that. He's still settling scores against Stu Sutcliffe, who died in 1962. We can all point to prize moments of Paul's vanity on display. That's too easy, but the fact is that any other human being with his talent would have twice as much ego. Lots of rock stars have more obtrusive egos than Paul McCartney, and none of them wrote here, there, and everywhere. As Chris Rock said when asked about Lorne Michaels' arrogance, hey man, I know arrogant cab drivers. You'll meet bigger divas than Paul every day of your life. It doesn't matter. Something about him still gives otherwise calm-blooded people the urge to take him down a notch. Really, it's Paul's aesthetic, his style, the goody two-shoes vibes that gets him in trouble. And that's fine. People can think whatever they want about his music, but that doesn't make him an asshole. Oh, and for all the music snobs out there, guess who does like Paul's music?
I mean, I'm in awe of McCartney. He's about the only one that I am in awe of, but I'm in awe of him. I mean, he can do it all, and he's never let up. You know, He's got the gift for melody. He's got the rhythm. He can play any instrument. He can scream and shout as good as anybody, and he can sing a ballad as good as anybody, you know. So, and his melodies are effortless. That's what you have to be in awe. I'm in awe of him. Just because he's just so damn effortless. I mean, I just wish he'd quit, you know. He's like, anything comes out of his mouth is just framed in a melody, you know.
Some people have argued that, lower tier assholery should be able to equate to permanent asshole status. Like someone can be an asshole for doing one small asshole-ish thing every day, and that can get them irredeemable status. But I don't think Paul is like that. I think Paul is probably an amazing person to work with, a brilliant artist, and a person to be around. But sometimes he just can be an asshole. And because he's such a kind of pleasant man otherwise, it seems more nefarious. It seems more hidden. All the Beatles were assholes sometimes, but they weren't always assholes in the same ways. George and John were just good old-fashioned genius, drug-addicted, eccentric, lunatic assholes. Paul never seemed quite so eccentric. And yeah, Paul seems to be motivated by money, just like everybody else. And it has gotten Beatles work out into the multiple generations of new fans. But I don't think his assholery, even at its extremes, goes beyond what the others did. Nor do I think it goes beyond what kind of everyday people do. He's got good relationship with his kids. They're happy and successful people, you know. As much as I like John Lennon more as a Beatle, I like Paul McCartney more as a father. So we have looked at 5 major accusations of assholery today in Paul McCartney's life. Out of a possible score of 100 points, Paul gets an even 62, which statistically is not very close to the cumulative irredeemable line of 85. But let me know your thoughts in the comments if you think I'm right or wrong. And that's it. Like and subscribe. Until next time, bye-bye.